They said I wasn't really family. The court records said I always had been. I want to start with that sentence, because for 30 years, I carried a specific, quiet uncertainty about where I actually belonged within my own biological family, an uncertainty that certain relatives were more than willing to confirm whenever it suited them, particularly once my grandmother's estate became a matter of significant financial consequence. I want to tell you exactly how I discovered the actual truth of my place in that family, because I think, if you've ever had people who share your own blood decide, conveniently, that this shared blood somehow doesn't count when it matters most, you already understand the particular, quiet ache of that specific rejection. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about belonging, about the people who quietly claim us, even when circumstances keep them at a distance, and the documented truths that sometimes surface only after we've stopped expecting them. If any part of this story feels close to your own experience, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Danielle. I am 34 years old and I spent most of my childhood in the foster care system, separated from my biological family after my mother's severe struggles with addiction made it impossible for her to safely care for me. I want to tell you what I eventually discovered about my biological grandmother's actual intentions toward me throughout those years, because the truth, once it finally surfaced, revealed something considerably different from what my biological cousins had always confidently assumed about my place within their family. I want to tell you about my early childhood first, because understanding these specific circumstances matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. My mother, Patricia, struggled with addiction throughout most of my early childhood, a struggle that eventually led to my removal from her care when I was 4 years old, placed into the foster care system after a specific incident that County Child Protective Services determined made her home genuinely unsafe for a young child. I want to be honest, that I remember relatively little from those early years directly, my memories from that specific period remaining fragmented and unreliable in the particular way early childhood memories often are, especially memories connected to genuine trauma and instability. I remember, in the fragments that have remained with me, a small apartment with a specific smell I've never quite been able to identify since, a persistent, unsettled feeling I've come to understand, through years of my own adult reflection and eventually some therapy, as the particular sensory imprint of a home that never felt genuinely safe or predictable. I remember, too, occasional flashes of my mother herself, moments of genuine tenderness alongside considerably more moments of confusion and fear, a complicated, fragmented portrait that I've spent much of my adult life trying to assemble into something resembling a coherent understanding of who she actually was beneath her addiction. I want to tell you about my grandmother, Eleanor, because understanding her specific relationship to this entire situation matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Eleanor was my mother's own mother, a woman who, according to everything I eventually learned, had her own complicated history attempting to help my mother throughout her ongoing struggles with addiction, cycling through periods of financial support, temporary caretaking arrangements, and eventually painful boundaries she felt forced to establish once it became clear that her continued financial support was, in practice, simply enabling my mother's addiction rather than genuinely helping her recover. I want to tell you about my own removal into foster care and my grandmother's specific response to this removal, because understanding this response matters enormously for everything that eventually happened decades later. When county services removed me from my mother's care, I later learned that my grandmother was, in fact, formally considered as a potential kinship placement, the arrangement child welfare systems typically prefer when a suitable biological relative is available and willing to take on a child's care. I want to tell you about the specific reason this kinship placement ultimately didn't happen, because this detail matters enormously for understanding the actual complexity of my grandmother's situation, rather than any simple, easy narrative of abandonment. I eventually learned, working with an attorney many years later, that my grandmother had been diagnosed, just months before my removal from my mother's care, with a serious cardiac condition that her own doctors determined made taking on full-time care of a young child during that specific period genuinely risky, both for her own health and for my stability, given the very real possibility that her condition might require extensive treatment or even prove fatal within a relatively short time frame. I remember learning this specific detail with a particular, complicated grief, understanding that my grandmother had faced her own genuine fear of mortality. At nearly the exact same moment, her own daughter's addiction was tearing apart what remained of our small family. Two simultaneous crises that, together, made the kind of decisive, confident intervention I might have once wished for from her simply practically impossible, given her own doctor's genuine concerns. I remember imagining, for the first time, what those specific months must have actually felt like for her, facing her own uncertain health prognosis while simultaneously watching her grandchild removed from her daughter's care, unable to step in the way she surely wished she could, constrained by medical realities entirely outside her own control. I want to tell you about my grandmother's specific decision during this period, because understanding it matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Rather than taking on full custody, a decision her own doctors genuinely discouraged given her health, my grandmother instead worked with the county's child welfare caseworker to establish what is sometimes called an open kinship arrangement, a formal designation allowing her continued contact and involvement in my life while I remained in the foster care system's formal custody. An arrangement, I want to be honest, I have no direct memory of myself, given how young I was throughout this entire period. I learned, much later, that this specific arrangement required my grandmother to undergo periodic reviews of her own health status, submitting updated medical documentation every 6 months to maintain her formal standing within this kinship designation, a bureaucratic requirement that, according to the correspondence I would eventually discover, she diligently maintained for years, understanding it as the only formal mechanism available to her for staying meaningfully connected to my situation, despite being unable to take on full custody herself. I want to tell you about my actual foster care experience, because understanding this broader context matters enormously for everything that eventually happened regarding my grandmother's specific involvement. I moved through several different foster placements throughout my childhood, some genuinely caring and stable, others considerably more difficult, before eventually being adopted at age 11 by a genuinely loving family who provided the first truly consistent, stable home I had experienced since my initial removal from my mother's care. I want to tell you that my adoptive parents, David and Susan, remain, to this day, the parents I consider my actual, primary family, people who showed up for me consistently in ways my biological family, for various complicated reasons, simply couldn't manage during those difficult early years. I remember specific placements throughout those years with varying degrees of clarity. A well-meaning but overwhelmed foster mother who cared for 3 other children alongside me and simply lacked the bandwidth for the kind of individual attention a child processing genuine trauma often needs. A considerably more difficult placement I stayed in for less than a year before caseworkers determined it wasn't meeting my basic needs. And finally, at age 9, a placement with a couple who would eventually become my own adoptive parents. 2 years of careful, patient relationship building before they formally adopted me, understanding, I think, exactly how much additional stability and trust a child with my particular history genuinely required before any permanent decision could feel safe for either of us. I remember the specific day of my adoption finalization with a clarity that surprises me even now, considerably more vivid than most of my earlier childhood memories, standing in a courtroom with David and Susan on either side of me, a judge asking me directly whether I understood what adoption meant and whether I wanted this specific family to become my own permanent family. I remember answering yes without any hesitation whatsoever, a certainty that, looking back now, represented the first genuinely stable ground I'd felt beneath me since early childhood. I want to tell you about my biological grandmother's continued involvement throughout my childhood, because this involvement, which I only fully understood many years later, matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I learned, again only much later through careful investigation, that my grandmother had maintained contact with my various caseworkers throughout my time in foster care, sending occasional letters and small gifts through the formal channels the child welfare system allowed, correspondence that my various foster placements, for reasons I never fully understood, rarely if ever actually shared with me directly. I remember discovering, among the documentation Mr. Halloway eventually provided, a specific note from one caseworker explaining that agency policy at the time generally discouraged directly relaying biological family correspondence to children in unstable transitional placements, understanding that receiving letters from family members unable to actually provide care could sometimes create confusion or false hope for children already navigating considerable instability. I understood, reading this specific policy explanation, that the barrier between my grandmother's genuine efforts and my own awareness of them had never been any failure of intention on her part, but rather a specific, if painful, institutional practice designed, however imperfectly, to protect children like myself from additional emotional complexity during an already difficult period. I want to tell you about my relationship with my broader biological family, particularly my mother's brother's children, my biological cousins, because understanding this specific dynamic matters enormously for everything that eventually happened regarding my grandmother's estate. My uncle Richard, my mother's older brother, had 2 children, Kimberly and Trevor, cousins I met only a handful of times throughout my entire childhood and early adulthood, at a few funerals and other significant family gatherings where my presence, I always sensed, was treated as somewhat awkward and unclear, an obligation extended more out of technical family courtesy than any genuine sense of connection or belonging. I remember a specific holiday gathering when I was around 16, one of the rare occasions my adoptive parents encouraged me to attend given my biological family's invitation, arriving at Richard's own house to find Kimberly and Trevor, then in their early 20s, engaged in easy, familiar conversation with cousins and relatives I didn't recognize, their shared history and inside jokes creating a specific kind of warmth I found myself standing entirely outside of, welcomed politely, but never genuinely included in the actual texture of their family's ongoing life together. I remember leaving that gathering early, telling my adoptive mother in the car afterward that I didn't think I needed to attend future gatherings, a decision she gently supported, understanding, I think, exactly how isolating that particular kind of technical inclusion without genuine belonging can feel for a teenager already navigating considerable identity confusion regarding her own complicated family history. I want to describe the specific texture of these limited interactions, because understanding this genuine coldness matters for everything that eventually happened. I remember specifically attending my mother's own funeral at age 19, my mother having eventually passed away from complications related to her decades of addiction, and I remember Kimberly, several years older than me, making a specific, pointed comment to another relative within my hearing, describing me as the one who got taken away, a phrase that struck me, even then, as carrying a specific, cold distance, positioning me as somehow separate from the actual family rather than a genuine, if complicated, part of it. I remember standing at the edge of that funeral gathering, my adoptive mother's hands steady on my shoulder, watching relatives I barely recognized embrace each other with genuine, shared grief, while I navigated my own considerably more complicated mixture of emotions, mourning a mother I had barely known as an adult, while simultaneously feeling, once again, the specific isolation of existing somewhere on the margins of a family that shared my own blood, but apparently very little else. I remember Kimberly's comment landing with a particular sharpness precisely because it confirmed something I had already privately suspected throughout my entire adolescence, that whatever technical family connection existed between us, it had never translated into any genuine sense of shared belonging. I want to tell you about my grandmother's eventual passing, because understanding the immediate aftermath of her death matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded regarding her estate. My grandmother, Eleanor, passed away 8 months ago, at the age of 81. Her cardiac condition, managed successfully for decades longer than her original doctors had anticipated, finally proving fatal after a relatively brief final illness. I want to be honest that I learned of her death somewhat belatedly, receiving a brief, formal phone call from Richard informing me of the funeral arrangements, a call that carried the same technical, obligatory quality that had characterized most of my limited interactions with this side of my biological family throughout my entire life. I want to tell you about attending this funeral, because the specific interactions I experienced there matter enormously for understanding everything that eventually happened. I attended my grandmother's funeral, understanding it as a genuine, if complicated, obligation given our biological relationship, despite the considerable emotional distance that had always characterized whatever connection technically existed between us. I remember standing somewhat apart from the immediate family during the service, Kimberly and Trevor positioned prominently near the front alongside their own father, while I remained toward the back, uncertain of my actual standing within this specific gathering of grief. I remember the specific quality of that service. A small church I'd never previously visited, unfamiliar hymns and eulogies delivered by relatives describing memories of my grandmother. I had no personal connection to myself, family vacations and holiday traditions I had simply never been part of. I remember feeling a specific, complicated grief throughout that entire service, mourning a woman I genuinely believed had remained largely disconnected from my own life, while simultaneously feeling the same persistent, familiar sense of standing just outside the actual boundaries of genuine family belonging that had characterized nearly every previous interaction with this particular branch of my biological family. I want to tell you about a specific conversation I overheard during the funeral reception, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered regarding my grandmother's true intentions toward me. During the reception following the funeral service, standing somewhat apart from the main gathering, I overheard Kimberly speaking with another relative, discussing, in general terms, the eventual settlement of my grandmother's estate. I remember her specifically mentioning that the family's attorney had indicated the will would likely be read within the following few weeks, and I remember another relative asking, somewhat pointedly, whether I would be included in this reading, given my own complicated history with the family. I remember standing near a table of untouched funeral casseroles, holding a paper cup of coffee I never actually drank, close enough to overhear this conversation without either woman apparently noticing my proximity, a strange, uncomfortable position that left me feeling almost like an accidental spy within my own extended family's gathering. I remember the specific, casual confidence in Kimberly's voice as she discussed my likely exclusion, a tone that suggested this wasn't a new or particularly considered opinion, but rather a long-standing, comfortable assumption she'd apparently carried for years, without ever once questioning its accuracy. I want to describe Kimberly's response to this specific question, because it represents the first indication I received of exactly how her family had apparently already decided to characterize my own standing within this broader family structure. Kimberly responded, with what struck me as considerable confidence, that she doubted I would be formally included in any meaningful way, explaining that while I was technically a biological grandchild, she understood that my grandmother's actual close relationships and ongoing care obligations had always remained with her own direct, continuously present grandchildren, herself and Trevor, rather than someone she described as having basically grown up completely separate from all of us. I want to tell you about my reaction to overhearing this specific conversation, because understanding my genuine, complicated feelings matters for everything that eventually happened. I want to be honest that I felt a specific, familiar sting hearing this characterization. Not entirely surprised given the general coldness that had always characterized my interactions with this particular branch of my biological family, but genuinely hurt nonetheless, understanding that whatever complicated history existed regarding my early childhood separation from this family, Kimberly's confident dismissal reflected a specific, deliberate choice to characterize me as fundamentally outside the family's genuine boundaries, rather than someone whose separation had resulted from circumstances entirely outside my own control as a small child. I want to tell you about the formal reading of my grandmother's will, because this event represents the actual moment everything I had believed about my standing within this family began to fundamentally shift. Approximately 3 weeks after the funeral, I received formal notification from an attorney's office, indicating that I was, in fact, named in my grandmother's will and requesting my attendance at a formal reading scheduled the following week. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this notification, because I think understanding my genuine surprise matters for everything that eventually happened. I remember reading this formal letter multiple times, genuinely uncertain whether it represented some kind of administrative error, given everything Kimberly had confidently suggested at the funeral reception regarding my likely exclusion from any meaningful inheritance. I decided, nonetheless, to attend this scheduled reading, understanding that regardless of whatever the will actually specified, I wanted to formally understand exactly what my grandmother had, in fact, decided regarding her own estate. I want to tell you about this formal reading because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I arrived at the attorney's office on the scheduled date, finding Richard, Kimberly, and Trevor already present, their expressions shifting into visible surprise as I walked into the room. Evidence, I understood immediately, that they had genuinely not expected my own attendance, despite the formal notification I had apparently received alongside them. I remember that specific office clearly. A modest conference room with a long table, Mr. Halloway seated at its head with a thick folder in front of him, Richard and his 2 adult children already seated on one side, their conversation dropping into an abrupt, uncomfortable silence the moment I entered. I remember taking a seat across from them, deliberately choosing not to sit closer to the family cluster, understanding, even in that moment, that whatever this reading revealed, I wanted to face it from a position of my own quiet composure rather than seeking any forced closeness with relatives who had never genuinely extended it themselves. I want to describe the specific moment the attorney began reading my grandmother's actual, formal wishes, because the details revealed something considerably different from what Kimberly had confidently predicted at the funeral reception. The attorney, a careful, methodical man named Mr. Halloway, explained that my grandmother had updated her will considerably in the final years of her life, working with him directly to ensure her actual specific wishes regarding her estate's distribution were clearly, unambiguously documented. He explained that the estate, valued at approximately $800,000, was to be divided into 3 genuinely equal shares among her 3 grandchildren, myself, Kimberly, and Trevor, each receiving approximately $267,000. I want to describe Kimberly's reaction to hearing this specific distribution, because it represents the actual moment her confident assumption regarding my exclusion fully collapsed. Kimberly's face, upon hearing this equal distribution announced, shifted through visible shock before settling into something closer to genuine anger, and she immediately interjected, asking Mr. Halloway whether some mistake had occurred, given that she understood I had never maintained any genuine, ongoing relationship with our grandmother throughout most of my childhood and early adulthood. I remember watching her hands grip the edge of the conference table, her voice rising slightly in a way that felt considerably more raw and unguarded than the confident, dismissive tone I'd overheard at the funeral reception weeks earlier. I remember Trevor placing a hand on his sister's arm, a small, quiet gesture of restraint, while Richard himself remained conspicuously silent, his own expression suggesting he was working through some private reckoning I couldn't quite read from across the table. I want to tell you what Mr. Holloway explained in response to this specific challenge, because his explanation revealed something I had never previously known about my grandmother's actual, ongoing involvement in my life throughout all those years. Mr. Holloway explained, calmly but firmly, that my grandmother had specifically anticipated exactly this kind of challenge, understanding that her own grandchildren might question my genuine standing within the family given my complicated early childhood circumstances. He explained that she had, therefore, specifically prepared a formal letter, notarized and included alongside her will, explicitly documenting her ongoing relationship with me throughout my childhood, along with copies of correspondence she had maintained with my various foster care caseworkers over the years. I remember Mr. Holloway's careful, unhurried delivery of this explanation, occasionally glancing toward Kimberly as though gauging how much detail her continued composure could reasonably absorb in that specific moment. He explained that my grandmother had visited his office on 3 separate occasions during her final years, specifically to update and expand this documentation. Understanding, he said, exactly how important it would eventually be to ensure her actual intentions couldn't be dismissed or challenged based on incomplete assumptions about my genuine place within the family. I want to describe learning about this specific documentation because it represents the moment I first understood my grandmother's true, ongoing involvement in my life, involvement I had never previously known existed. Mr. Holloway provided me with copies of this documentation following the formal reading, and I want to tell you about what I discovered reading through these materials, because they fundamentally transformed my understanding of my grandmother's actual feelings toward me throughout my entire childhood. I remember driving directly to a quiet coffee shop after leaving the attorney's office, unable to bring myself to wait until returning home to open the sealed envelope Mr. Holloway had handed me, spreading the contents across a small corner table while my coffee went entirely cold and untouched beside me. I remember the specific weight of that folder, considerably thicker than I'd anticipated, evidence, even before I'd read a single page, that whatever it contained represented years of accumulated, careful attention rather than any brief, token gesture. The correspondence included dozens of letters my grandmother had written to my various caseworkers over the years, inquiring about my well-being, my school performance, my general development, letters spanning from my initial removal from my mother's care through my eventual adoption and beyond. I want to be honest that reading these letters, sitting alone in my own car in the attorney's parking lot, following the formal reading, represented one of the most emotionally overwhelming experiences of my entire adult life. I want to share some of what these letters revealed, because I think understanding their specific content matters enormously for understanding my grandmother's actual, ongoing devotion to me. Throughout years I had always believed she remained largely absent from. In one particularly early letter, dated only months after my initial removal from my mother's care, my grandmother wrote to my first caseworker, asking detailed questions about how I was adjusting to my new placement, whether I had any specific comfort items from home, and whether it might be appropriate for her to send a small package of my favorite childhood toys, a request the caseworker apparently approved, given a brief follow-up note confirming that a package had, in fact, been delivered, and that I had responded well to receiving these familiar items during an otherwise deeply disorienting transition. In another letter, dated shortly after my adoption at age 11, my grandmother wrote to my final caseworker, asking whether it might be appropriate to reach out directly to my new adoptive family, expressing her genuine hope that I was settling well into what she understood would hopefully become my permanent, stable home. The caseworker's response, also included in this documentation, explained that given the specific sensitivities involved in supporting a newly adopted child's stability, it was generally recommended that biological family members allow the child considerable time to fully settle into their new family before initiating any additional contact, guidance my grandmother had apparently, painfully, decided to respect, despite her own evident, ongoing desire to remain connected to me. I want to tell you about a specific letter that affected me most deeply, because I think it reveals something genuinely important about my grandmother's actual character and her ongoing feelings toward me throughout all those years. In a letter dated approximately 5 years before her death, my grandmother wrote to Mr. Holloway directly, explaining her specific reasoning for ensuring I would receive an equal share of her estate, despite my limited direct contact with the broader family throughout my childhood. She wrote, "Danielle's absence from our family gatherings was never her own choice, nor genuinely a reflection of her standing within this family. Circumstances entirely outside her control, my own health, the county's guidance regarding newly adopted children's stability, kept us physically distant throughout most of her childhood. But distance was never the same thing as absence of love or genuine, ongoing concern. I have followed her well-being as closely as circumstances allowed throughout her entire life, and I want my estate to reflect what I have always privately known to be true, that she is every bit as much my genuine grandchild as Kimberly or Trevor, regardless of how physically distant our relationship was ultimately forced to remain." I remember reading this specific passage 3 times in that quiet coffee shop, my hands trembling slightly around the pages, the specific handwriting itself carrying a shakiness I recognized, even without any direct comparison, as likely reflecting her advancing age at the time she wrote it. I remember feeling, in that exact moment, an overwhelming combination of grief and gratitude, understanding that this woman I had spent my entire life believing had largely forgotten or dismissed me, had actually, quietly, carried this specific truth about our relationship for years, waiting for the right circumstances to finally reveal it. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to reading this specific passage, because it fundamentally transformed my understanding of my own childhood and my grandmother's actual, ongoing role within it. I sat with this letter for a considerable time, understanding, for the first time in my entire adult life, that the woman I had always perceived as largely absent and disconnected from my childhood had, in fact, quietly, persistently maintained whatever connection circumstances allowed, constrained by health limitations and professional guidance rather than any genuine lack of love or concern for my own well-being. I want to tell you about the specific confrontation that occurred following this formal reading, because it represents an important continuation of this entire story. Kimberly, following the reading, requested a private conversation with me, and I want to describe this conversation carefully, because understanding her specific reaction matters for the full resolution of this entire story. I remember stepping into a small side office Mr. Holloway offered us for privacy, Kimberly's earlier anger having visibly softened into something considerably more uncertain and vulnerable, her arms wrapped around herself in a posture I hadn't seen from her during any of our previous, limited interactions throughout my life. I remember her starting to speak several times before actually finding the words she seemed to be searching for, and I remember waiting, patiently, understanding that whatever she was working toward saying clearly required more effort than her usual confident, dismissive manner typically allowed. She told me, with visible difficulty, that she had genuinely believed, throughout her entire life, that my absence from family gatherings reflected some kind of deliberate choice on either my own part or my grandmother's part, rather than the specific, complicated circumstances the documentation had just revealed. She admitted that she had never actually asked her own father, Richard, for more detailed context regarding exactly why I had remained so separate from the family throughout my childhood, simply absorbing a general, vague understanding that positioned me as somehow peripheral to the family's genuine core. I remember watching Kimberly's own posture shift throughout this admission, her earlier defensive confidence gradually softening into something considerably more uncertain, her eyes occasionally drifting toward the small window in that side office, as though she needed somewhere else to look while working through genuinely difficult, unfamiliar territory. I remember thinking, in that specific moment, that this was likely the most vulnerable I had ever seen her. A woman I had known my entire life primarily through her confident, dismissive certainty, now genuinely grappling with the possibility that her own certainty had been built on considerably shakier ground than she'd ever previously imagined. I remember her voice cracking slightly as she added that she'd repeated this same assumption to Trevor over the years, and likely to other relatives as well, never once questioning whether her own confident narrative actually reflected the genuine truth. Understanding, now, watching her own father's uncomfortable silence throughout the will's reading, that Richard himself likely knew considerably more about the actual circumstances than he had ever bothered sharing with his own children. I want to tell you about a conversation I eventually had with Richard himself, several weeks after that formal reading, because understanding his own specific role in shaping his children's assumptions about me matters considerably for the fuller picture of everything that happened. Richard reached out to me directly, requesting to meet for coffee, an invitation that genuinely surprised me given how minimal our own direct interactions had remained throughout my entire life, even compared to my limited contact with Kimberly and Trevor. I remember sitting across from him at a quiet diner, watching him turn his own coffee cup slowly in his hands before finally speaking, the same nervous habit I would later recognize as a shared family trait, having watched Kimberly do exactly the same thing during our own difficult conversation weeks earlier. He told me, with considerable difficulty, that he had, in fact, known far more about my grandmother's ongoing efforts to stay connected with me than he had ever shared with his own children. He explained that his mother had occasionally mentioned, in passing, her continued correspondence with my caseworkers, updates she would sometimes share during their own regular phone calls, details Richard had simply never thought to pass along to Kimberly and Trevor, understanding, I think, that doing so would have required him to more fully confront his own complicated, unresolved feelings about his sister's addiction and my own resulting removal from the family's daily life. I remember asking him, directly, why he had allowed his children to grow up believing something he knew to be considerably more complicated than the simple narrative they'd absorbed. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that acknowledging the full truth would have required him to also acknowledge his own guilt regarding how little effort he had personally made, throughout my entire childhood, to maintain any meaningful connection himself, understanding that if his own mother had been quietly working to stay connected despite her health limitations, his own complete absence looked considerably less excusable by comparison. I want to be honest with you about how this admission affected me, because I think it matters for understanding the broader, more complicated picture of exactly how this specific family dynamic had developed over so many years. I did not feel simple anger toward Richard upon hearing this admission, though I want to acknowledge that some anger was certainly present. I felt instead something closer to a weary, if genuine, understanding, recognizing that grief, guilt, and avoidance often travel together in families navigating addiction and its ripple effects across multiple generations, and that Richard's own silence likely reflected his own unprocessed shame, rather than any deliberate cruelty toward me specifically. I want to tell you about my own response to Kimberly's admission, because I think it matters for understanding how I chose to approach this specific reconciliation. I told Kimberly, honestly, that I understood how easily an incomplete, second-hand understanding of complicated family circumstances could calcify into a confident, if inaccurate, assumption over years of limited direct engagement with the actual details. I told her that while her previous comments had genuinely hurt me, I recognized that she had been operating from a genuinely incomplete picture rather than any deliberate malice. I want to tell you about telling my adoptive parents, David and Susan, about everything I had discovered, because their own reaction mattered enormously to how I eventually processed this entire experience. I drove to their house the same evening I first read through the letters, still emotionally raw from everything I had absorbed that afternoon, and I remember sitting at their own kitchen table, a considerably warmer, more familiar space than the biological family gatherings that had always left me feeling so uncertain of my own place. I remember Susan reaching for my hand almost immediately as I began explaining what I'd found, and I remember David listening with the same quiet, focused attention he'd always brought to every difficult conversation throughout my entire adolescence. I asked them, at one point, whether they had ever known about my grandmother's ongoing correspondence with my caseworkers, given that they had adopted me at the exact age when several of these letters were written. Susan told me, gently, that our adoption caseworker had, in fact, mentioned during our own initial placement meetings that my biological grandmother had expressed interest in maintaining some form of contact, but that the agency's standard guidance at the time recommended waiting until I was fully settled before considering any such arrangement, guidance my adoptive parents had followed carefully, understanding it as being in my own best interest at the time. I remember hearing this confirmation, a strange layered grief, understanding that multiple caring adults across my entire childhood had each been following genuinely well-intentioned guidance that, together, had created years of unnecessary separation between myself and a grandmother who had never actually stopped wanting to know me. David told me, quietly, that he wished, in hindsight, they had pushed harder to facilitate some earlier connection, though he also acknowledged that hindsight always makes such decisions look clearer than they genuinely felt in the moment, when protecting my fragile, newly forming sense of stability had felt like the only responsible priority. I want to tell you about my own reflection regarding this entire experience, because I think it matters for understanding how I've processed everything that happened. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now. Several months removed from that formal reading of my grandmother's will, I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this clearly through documented legal proof of my grandmother's genuine intentions. I feel, instead, something considerably more complicated, profound grief for a relationship that circumstances never allowed to fully develop during my grandmother's own lifetime, alongside genuine, hard-won comfort in finally understanding that her apparent absence throughout my childhood reflected painful, constrained circumstances rather than any genuine lack of love or concern for my well-being. I have since begun a tentative, careful correspondence with Kimberly, considerably more honest and vulnerable than anything we managed throughout our previous years of limited, awkward family gatherings. She has asked me, several times, to share more about my own childhood experiences, genuinely curious now in a way she never previously demonstrated, and I find myself, cautiously, appreciating this late but apparently genuine interest in actually understanding who I am, rather than simply accepting whatever second-hand assumptions had previously shaped her understanding of my place within our family. I remember one particular exchange, several weeks into this developing correspondence, where Kimberly asked me directly what it had actually felt like, growing up moving between different foster placements, a question delivered with a genuine, careful curiosity, rather than the polite, distant courtesy that had characterized nearly every previous interaction between us. I remember taking considerable time crafting my response, understanding that this represented the first genuine invitation either of us had ever extended toward actually knowing each other beyond our shared, complicated biological connection. We have since made tentative plans to meet for dinner, just the two of us, something neither of us had ever previously done throughout our entire lives, despite technically being cousins for over 3 decades. I want to be honest that I don't yet know exactly what this developing relationship with Kimberly will ultimately become, whether it will deepen into something genuinely close, or simply settle into a more honest, if still measured, version of the distant courtesy we'd maintained throughout most of our lives. But I find myself, for the first time, genuinely curious to find out, rather than simply resigned to whatever limited connection circumstances had previously allowed between us. I visited my grandmother's grave for the first time last month, standing there for a considerable while, holding the folder of letters that had taught me more about her genuine feelings toward me than 30 years of limited, awkward, in-person interactions ever managed to convey. I told her, out loud, standing alone in that quiet cemetery, that I finally understood, and that I wished, more than almost anything else, that circumstances had allowed us the chance to build the kind of relationship her letters revealed she had always genuinely wanted with me. I remember the specific quality of that afternoon, a light rain beginning just as I arrived, the kind of weather that somehow felt appropriate for the particular grief I was carrying, equal parts sorrow and gratitude in a combination I hadn't previously experienced quite so intensely. I remember reading portions of her letters aloud at her graveside, understanding it as a strange but genuinely meaningful way of finally completing a conversation that circumstances had never allowed us to have directly, while she was still alive to hear it from me herself. I left one of the smaller childhood toys she had once arranged to have delivered to me at her grave that afternoon, a small stuffed rabbit I had somehow kept through every single foster placement and eventual adoption, understanding it as a fitting way to return, symbolically, something she had first given me during the very beginning of our complicated, constrained, but genuinely persistent relationship. I used a portion of my inheritance to establish a small scholarship fund specifically supporting foster youth pursuing higher education, understanding it as a meaningful way to honor my grandmother's specific, careful attention to my own well-being throughout years when circumstances kept us apart, extending that same careful attention toward other children navigating similarly complicated, uncertain circumstances. I remember the specific afternoon I finalized the paperwork establishing this fund, sitting in a modest nonprofit office that helps coordinate exactly this kind of scholarship support for young people aging out of foster care. And I remember naming it, without much hesitation, the Eleanor Fund, understanding it as a small, meaningful way to ensure my grandmother's own quiet, persistent devotion to a child's circumstances kept at a distance might continue extending outward to other young people navigating similarly uncertain paths. I have since met two of the fund's first recipients, both of them aging out of the same county foster care system I once moved through myself, and I find a particular, quiet satisfaction in these conversations, understanding that my grandmother's own careful attention, once directed so persistently toward me across years of physical distance, now continues rippling outward in ways she likely never specifically imagined but that I believe she would have genuinely appreciated. I want to tell you about my own reflection regarding this entire experience, because I think it matters for understanding how I've processed everything that happened. If there is one thing I want you to take from the story, it is this: physical distance and constrained circumstances are not the same thing as absence of genuine love or concern, however similar they might appear from the outside looking in. My grandmother's apparent absence throughout my childhood concealed a persistent, if constrained, devotion I never had the opportunity to fully understand until reading her own careful documentation years after her death. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that formal reading. Second-hand family narratives, absorbed without genuine investigation into their underlying accuracy, can calcify into confident assumptions that cause genuine, if unintentional, harm. Kimberly's confident dismissal of my standing within the family reflected an incomplete understanding she had simply never thought to investigate more thoroughly. Here is a third truth. Documentation, prepared carefully and deliberately in advance of anticipated future disputes, can preserve truths that might otherwise be lost or contested after we're no longer present to defend them ourselves. My grandmother's specific foresight in preparing this documentation ensured her actual wishes and feelings survived any challenge her own grandchildren might have otherwise successfully raised. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require humiliating those who previously doubted or dismissed us. I chose to accept Kimberly's genuine, if belated, acknowledgement rather than using this vindication as an opportunity for retribution, understanding that the actual truth, once properly established, mattered considerably more to me than any additional satisfaction further confrontation might have provided. Here is a fifth truth, one that surprised me most as I processed this entire experience. Sometimes healing from childhood instability doesn't come from finally receiving the specific love we always wanted, in the specific form we always imagined wanting it, but from discovering, even years later, that this love was quietly present all along, doing whatever it could within circumstances that never allowed it to be expressed the way either of us might have genuinely preferred. I have found myself thinking, in the months since this entire experience, about all the other quiet, constrained forms love sometimes takes within families, navigating genuinely difficult circumstances, addiction, illness, the countless complicated barriers that separate people who genuinely care for each other, without ever fully intending the distance those barriers create. I think my grandmother's story, and my own, offers a particular kind of comfort for anyone who has ever wondered whether an absent family member's silence reflected genuine indifference, or something considerably more complicated and constrained. A love that persisted quietly, doing what it could, waiting patiently for circumstances to finally allow it the chance to be properly seen. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who love us most are constrained by circumstances entirely outside anyone's control, unable to demonstrate that love in the ways we might have wished for or expected, yet still finding whatever quiet, persistent ways remain available to them to maintain genuine connection and concern, ways that may only become fully visible to us long after we've stopped waiting to see them. That is my story. 30 years of believing I existed somewhere on the periphery of my own biological family, one formal reading of a will I never expected to be genuinely included in, and one collection of carefully preserved letters that finally revealed exactly how persistently my grandmother had loved me throughout every year circumstances kept us apart. I think, sometimes, about that small package of childhood toys my grandmother arranged to have delivered to me during my very first foster placement. An act I have no direct memory of myself, but that I now understand, represented her very first attempt to reach toward me across a distance neither of us had chosen. I keep a copy of that specific caseworker correspondence in a small folder now, alongside the letters themselves, evidence, tangible and undeniable, that even during the earliest, most disorienting days of my own displacement, someone who shared my blood was already quietly working to ensure I felt some small, familiar comfort within an entirely unfamiliar world. I think about my grandmother often now, considerably more than I ever did throughout most of my adult life, when I genuinely believed our relationship amounted to little more than distant biological obligation. I understand now that grief for her arrives in a different shape than the grief I felt for my own mother. Less about mourning what I actually had and lost, and more about mourning a relationship that circumstances never allowed either of us to fully build, despite her own persistent, quiet efforts to maintain whatever thread of connection remained available to her. I keep her final letter, the one addressed directly to Mr. Halloway explaining her reasoning, framed now on a small shelf in my own home, alongside a single photograph I eventually found among her belongings, one I had never seen before, an image of myself as a small child that she had apparently requested from one of my earliest caseworkers, kept carefully all these years in her own private collection. I look at that photograph sometimes, a version of myself I barely remember being, understanding that even in that specific moment, decades before either of us could have anticipated how our story would eventually unfold, she had already been quietly, persistently choosing to claim me as her own, regardless of what circumstances, or her own grandchildren, might have otherwise assumed. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that love sometimes persists in forms we never fully recognize until much later, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time you discovered someone had cared for you more deeply and consistently than you ever realized while they were still alive to show it directly. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.